Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a non-traditional legal program with your host and trusted advisor, Liz Myska, your guide through the web of life's dilemmas.
Welcome to another edition of Connecting the Dots. I'm your host, Liz Myska. And today I have the distinct pleasure of having an assistant professor at Worcester State University, Dr. Andrew Piazza. Welcome to Connecting the Dots.
Thank you for having me. It's a very pleasure to be here.
You and I met at the Wellness Fair. I was told I had to meet you, but immediately when I met you and we started talking, I thought, there's common ground here. And I know that you have a great interest in walkability and in public health. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how you came to Worcester, and how and how you see public health and walkability in Worcester?
Sure. So I guess I don't know how far I should go back, but I am originally from Florida. So I was born there, studied at the University of Florida in health education and behavior. That's where I got my undergraduate degree and my master's degree in health education and behavior. And then I got accepted to the PhD program at Florida and Alabama, and I was at a crossroads of, do I go to Florida or Alabama? Maybe a lot of people up here think they're kind of the same thing, but different things. So I actually decided to leave home, go to Alabama, and spent 3 years there pursuing a PhD in health education and promotion, which health education is a subset of public health, with a little bit of additional training in behavioral science of why people make decisions and things like that. So you can, if you're not quite sure what health education is, you can think of it as just public health, but it's kind of a subset of public health, but we're trained as public health professionals. And so after getting my PhD at the University of Alabama, I cast a net as large as the United States and looked at a bunch of different schools, and I kind of knew that I wanted to do some research, but I also wanted to teach. I wanted to work with community members. I wanted to work with students. And so that led me to Worcester State University, which is, more of a teaching university than one of those big R1 institutions where you're having to do a lot of research. I think there's value in it, but just for me personally, I wanted to do more of the interacting with young people, interacting with community members. And Worcester State University has been a great fit for me. So. And I guess to answer the second part of your question, I thought it was interesting when I ran into you that I keep seeing you come up, right? And I'm not seeking you out, I'm not searching for you, but we
I just bubble up.
Yeah. But I think that's a sign that we're kind of focused on the same, we're in the same space together. We're focusing on the same things.
Absolutely.
And, I've always, my research interest, not to go too much into that, but I'm into injury prevention, and my dissertation research was on pedestrian safety, and so I'm kind of in that wheelhouse. Now that I live in Worcester, I want a lot of the same things that other people in Worcester want. They want safe spaces to walk, regardless of, if you have a disability or you just want a safe place to walk, and I think there's common ground there that we all can be working together, and that's what I'm finding when we encounter each other more and more frequently lately.
You're sparking in my mind when I grew up in Holden, and when I was 5, I ran across the street and was hit by a car, and in my mind, it was always, so you're talking about injury prevention, and it was actually a student driver that hit me. And again, not his fault. I ran. But anyways, I was hit in the head and I was hit in the leg. And shortly thereafter, I started primary school, and my parents were told that I was going to have vision issues, undefined. And for the majority of my life, until the year 2000, I wore glasses or contact lenses, but I never experienced anything, to my mind, deleterious, with my vision. And I drove vehicle, and I loved to drive, and I was a good driver, and I would drive long distances because my parents ultimately ended up moving to Philadelphia. area. In the late 1990s, when I would go to the ophthalmologist, I had acquired a retina specialist. And when I would ask about why do I have a retina specialist? And I was petted and told, well, your retina is taxed. Okay, what does that mean? And I thought, well, there's nothing to be anxious about or whatever. And then in 2000, I had cataract surgery. And again, after the cataract surgery, my vision improved for a very small period of time. And for the first time in my life, I could see, when I got in the shower, I could see the shampoo bottle. I could read, herbal essence. And I could also see the dirt that I never had been able to see when I was, a contact lens wearer or a glasses wearer. But then between 2000 and 2005, I started experiencing night blindness, and slowly the ebbing away of my peripheral vision. Back and forth to specialists who wouldn't name names and wouldn't claim what it was, and I was just as happy because it's like, well, if it doesn't have a name, I must not have it. Right. So I was dumbfounded in 2005 when I went to Mass Eye and Ear, and I was deemed to have a disease. Retinitis pigmentosa, a retinal disease, and I had never heard of it. I didn't know what it was, and I was, like I said, dumbfounded. And the first thing I asked was, "Am I going to be able to drive?" Because the center of my universe was the car, in the sense that I didn't feel that I could function properly, personally and professionally, without being able to drive a car. There's more to the story, but in 2008, I was deemed legally blind, and now that's when the driver's license, really went away because I had to cut it up and send it back to the Registry of Motor Vehicles. And I was that was an epiphany of my life that, okay, now what do I do? So all during, up until that point, I had always been physically active and, I'll call it, not a fitness freak, but, exercising. And I needed to alter my behavior, I guess, and that's why I'm going to throw it back to you. I needed to alter my behavior and depend more upon acquiring skills that I might not have had previously, and honing skills that I had but were dormant or in an infant stage. And so my transition from being a sighted driver to a visually impaired walker, and my transition from being able to cross streets safely, because when I drove, I was very careful and I was very cognizant of, slow down, my father had always told me, if there's a ball, there's going to be a kid and probably a dog chasing it, so be very, very cognizant. Right. But then when I became the pedestrian and thinking, you don't see me, because you're not paying attention, and I can't see you, it altered my behavior. And so with that whole soliloquy, that's why I'm having been a driver, but being a careful driver and realizing there are so many distractions being a driver, and so much now, signage everywhere, blinking lights, and and weather conditions, and now being a pedestrian that is really relying upon the attentiveness of a driver, and I'm relying upon not being able to see a car, and particularly if the car is silent, but listening for things, and are people turning? What does a car sound like when it decelerates or accelerates? It just broadened my whole horizon, so that's why I'm so keenly interested. And that's why I'm going to throw it back to you with pedestrian safety, because now I see it from both sides of the coin, and I don't want to put my body on the line, because I could easily make a mistake, and I know other people can make a mistake. They didn't see me because because of I was wearing dark clothing, or it was inclement. So I really have to be very choosy.
Right.
So I've given you a lot of meat there on the plate. Right. I'm shoving it towards you. So
let's see if I could pick through some of this. So I think it's interesting to hear your perspective, because one thing that I try to do with my students is shatter their worldview. And I try to shatter my own worldview every day. And just listening to you talk right now, I'm realizing that it's always been the case, but there's a lot of things that are true and real that we don't think about just when we operate day to day. And so just hearing you talk, I'm realizing of how much of driving actually relies on vision.
Yes.
And how important that is. And that's just the way that we've set up, the streets with signs that don't make noise, and even as a pedestrian, we have crosswalks that rely on vision, and a lot of them don't make sounds. So part of my worldview right now is being challenged that, oh wow, I guess a lot of this stuff does rely on vision. And so I try to always challenge what I think reality is. And so I guess I would say that when approaching pedestrian safety, I try to, or anything, because I teach in public health, and I always try to address any public health issue from a multiple angles, because I feel like one solution isn't going to solve everything.
Right.
So a lot of times we think, oh, if only the crosswalks made a sound, visually impaired people would be perfectly happy. But it's that is one piece of it that can't go away. But just because that's not the only solution doesn't mean that it's insurmountable or we can't approach this at all. So I try to just think about how can we take multiple approaches to solve these problems in public health. And I think some people can get tunnel vision, no pun intended, but where like they'll die on a hill of let's change all the crosswalks so they make sounds now, but they'll neglect the other things like speed limits and traffic signs and lane markings. And so I don't know if that answers any
No. Well, again, it makes me think when I'm training individuals, again, training myself, because I'm constantly thinking, oh, now I've discovered something that I didn't know, but the avoidance. So maybe a better way of describing this is, when I was deemed legally blind, I was terrified of the white cane, absolutely terrified of it, essentially for two reasons. One, because I thought, I'm going to trip over that thing, I'm going to injure myself, and I can't afford, to injure myself financially or otherwise. I can't afford. But also, it was the notion, the stereotype of that's a blind person, and I am not a blind person, and so that was something that I needed to address, like you say, challenge myself, because it's like, well, what is a blind person, Liz? Right. And I would profess, well, I can see, so I'm not blind, ergo, I'm not blind. And that's a very easy trap to fall into. And now, again, now I'm leaping ahead. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't concern me at all to identify as a visually impaired person. It doesn't bother me at all to appear in public with a white cane. I know when I was sighted, I would look at the white cane and I would know, oh, that's a blind person. But I wouldn't have necessarily any pejorative or derogatory things attached to that. Right. But as a blind person, I'm like, they're thinking, I can't do this. And that's messing with my mind, and I'm thinking, well, I'll show you, and I may be throwing caution to the wind and putting myself in a really compromised situation. And so again, so I might avoid an entire situation, because I'm like, I would think it through, or think I would think it through, and like, no, I'm just not going to go, because it's going to be too difficult for me to traverse, or to ask for help, or to have somebody, to admit that I can't see something. So that I guess that goes back to the behavior. And that's changing behavior as human beings is possible, but it's difficult.
Right. And a lot of times when I talk about health with my students, because I teach public health, and we talk a lot about, or I like to talk a lot about, before we dive too much into this public health stuff, let's talk about what is your philosophy of health? What's your definition of health? Because they don't realize it, but what your values, attitudes, opinions are about what it means to be healthy and all of that dictates how you practice as a nurse or a physical therapist or a doctor or a lawyer or just as a functioning member of society. And so I really challenge them to dig down and look at what their beliefs, attitudes are towards health. And we also do touch on the environment a little bit, because the environment can dictate your health. And I'll give you an example. So thinking about a limitation that I have, and sometimes I tell my students, okay, I have a disability, I have a limitation. I have to eat every few days or else I'll die. Right? That's a limitation imposed upon us by just being biological creatures. And so why don't we consider that a disability? Because there's a McDonald's on every corner, right? There's a grocery store everywhere. If you want food, you can, more or less, you can get food in this country. So we don't really call that a disability or a limitation, but really it is. Because if we were out in the middle of a field somewhere and our environment were such that there was no food around, that would be a pretty big limitation, right? And that's something that we carry with us. My office building where I work, my bones and my legs are so brittle that I can't jump out of the third floor window to get outside of the building. They had to install a door at the ground level so that I could get out of the building, right? And that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but that's a limitation, that we have to exit buildings through ground level. That's a human limitation, but why don't we call it a disability? Why aren't we worried about it? Because every building is set up with a door at ground level, right? And so I try to challenge my students that way and say, okay, so now think that if you had a little bit less common limitation, visually impaired or something along those lines, the environment dictates your health at that point. Why do we call that a limitation or that a disability? And, having to eat, having to drink, we can't jump, fall from a tree without breaking a bone. Why is that not a disability? So I try to kind of break my students out of that, reset them so that then they can fall back into their own philosophy of health and really examine their values, opinions, belief about health. Because again, that's going to dictate how they practice as future, whatever they're going to be.
Right, future professionals.
Correct.
There's so many places I could go here. Because when I was sighted, I never considered entering or exiting a building challenging. And familiarity becomes very, very important too. And so I've hit on a couple of things. So when we are, again, I didn't even know when I first became legally blind that you have to be trained to use the cane. It's like, you do? For some reason I thought, it was like a divining rod and, it would just hold on to it and it would go. And again, I was very, not welcoming to my instructor, who was a saint. But anyway, he suggested we were doing outdoor work. This was in the fall, and first he wanted to observe, what could I see. So we went for a walk, and I live very close here to the studio, so it was on city streets. And again, he was evaluating, how far was I on the sidewalk from the street? Was I picking up that there was a fire hydrant? Was I able to discern, I needed to step down from a curb? But I was, in my mind, all I was thinking of that he's going to whip out that dreaded cane and he's going to, hand it to me and I'm going to have to learn how to use it and I don't know how to use it. But again, he slowly brought me into it. And again, he acted as my sighted guide without the cane first. And he would say, Liz, feel my body. Feel it going up, feel it going down. Feel it, that we're compressed into a space. You need to line up behind me. So it was words and body movements and description. And I guess that goes back to health. I'm again, I resolved when I was 16 years old, which was many, many years ago, that I would always be physically active in some manner, shape, or form. I like to exercise. I like to walk. I like to hike. Those things, when I started losing my sight and the car went away, I thought, how am I going to do this? But again, I've adapted. I can still walk, and I do walk, and I walk by myself in familiar places, and I walk in the companionship of others that I may ask to guide me, or I may not. Again, it depends upon the situation. So health to me is physical activity, but it's also it's a quality of life issue. So it's proper rest. It's proper nutrition. It's mindfulness. It's being engaged. It's not closeting yourself off and having a pity party and saying, "Woe is me," "Oh, I used to be able to do these things," and it has, I think, less to do with sight loss, but I think it has more to do with aging. That yes, we can't do things. I can't do the things that I did when I was 16, but I don't want to do those things either. Right. And also, when I became legally blind, I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to do certain things, like drive a car. That's true. I can't drive a car. But hey, maybe there will be autonomous cars. And I have driven cars. So I'm not remorseful about or resentful that I never got the opportunity. And that puts me in a different category than many of my compatriots who were born blind or born legally blind, who long for that opportunity. That gets me back into, the psychological and the social. But the psychological for me is, we as human beings, we mourn the loss of things that we've had. But if we've never had them, we don't have the experience. Right. And that also, when I first started consorting with other visually impaired people, and this I'll actually tell this story. There was this woman named Sherry, and she was in her 60s when I met her. Born blind. She had grown up here in Worcester, and she had been mainstreamed at Lee Street School for the first 3 years of her life, and then she transitioned to Perkins School for the Blind. So knowing that Lee Street School is an old Worcester school with an old brick building with a playground, tarred playground with a jungle gym and swings. So I said to Sherry, "Weren't you jealous at recess?" Because I'm thinking, there's a visual. She said, "Visual." She said, "I didn't know what they were doing because I couldn't see them." I'm thinking, "Oh yeah, she could hear them. Right. She could hear the kids. She could hear the swings. She could hear them all." And I guess the teachers had something else that she did, but she wasn't envious. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know what they were doing. And I just thought that, oh yes, that's true. If you've never had it, and when people extol, the beautiful sunrise or the sunset, if you've never seen it, those are just words to you, and you don't feel. You may feel left out, but you're not longing for. Oh, I wish I could. I wish I could see that. You've imagined it in your mind. Right. So again, as human beings, our behavior, I think, is so much dictated about, again, our environment, those social determinants of health, our education, right. our experience, who we've come into, who we come into contact with, who we avoid, what situations we avoid. Because again, avoidance became a big ticket item for me. It's kind of like, oh, I know what's going to happen there. Right. I'm going to avoid that. Right. I am going to come up with an excuse. I'm not going. And initially, again, I was never a trial attorney. I'm a transactional attorney, but there were times when I needed to go to courthouses, and I was very self-conscious. It's kind of like, people are going to look at me and they're going to know she's blind, by the white cane. Now, I'm blind. It's okay. Right. Come and ask me. Come and ask me how I do it. I want to tell you. I want to bring you into my world. This may become your world. And I guess that goes back to the aging. At some point in time, all of us will be disabled, whether it's temporary or permanent. So it's going back to what you said, it's part of it's part of our existence.
Right.
So,
and I guess I would add, is it possible to prolong, as you said, at some point we will all be disabled, but I kind of think it's possible to prolong or to delay, I guess, that state the way we, to go back to environment, there's a word that we use, accessibility, right? If you are building an accessible house, it has certain width of the door, certain thresholds, the shower's designed a certain way. But there's also this term visitability, which is the idea that, have you heard of that?
No, I haven't.
So visitability is this idea that even if you're not yet disabled, you might have somebody visit you who needs accommodations. And so to exclude them from your home, not explicitly, but the way your home is designed, it's not accessible to them. So if we grow old in that home, right, then we may be the ones requiring those thresholds and the shower to be designed a certain way. So I guess I would say that, we could even think a little bit harder as a society in how we design new construction, not for the now, but for the future, to delay exactly what you just said. Because again, it goes back to my statement earlier, that my tongue-in-cheek statement that I can't jump out of the third-story window because my bones are so brittle, but that's a limitation that all of us have, but we don't see it as a limitation because we've taken, quote-unquote, taken care of it in society. And so I think there's a space for meaningful dialogue and just, again, to shatter people's worldview. And I'm open to my worldview being shattered. I try to shatter my students' worldview, just to think about, the reality that we have today might not be the reality that we have tomorrow, and we need to plan for certain things so that people are included in society, so that we're not shutting people out, and that people can thrive. And the more people who thrive that aren't me means that I can thrive myself. So even in a selfish way, like I want people to do well in society so that I can do well, because nobody's going to do well in a society where half the population is excluded from certain activities.
Exactly. And sedentary and despondent and hopeless and not contributing in any way, in any manner, shape, or form, and in a quandary how they could.
Right.
Alas, we are out of time.
It went quickly.
And we have just scratched the surface, literally scratched the surface. I would love to have you back again.
I would love to be back.
Just quickly, what is your definition of health?
So my definition of health, actually, I have a whole 20-minute, because for it to make sense, it has to make sense in the context of a discussion. But I would say my philosophy of health, which is different. Your definition is informed by your philosophy, but I would say overall my philosophy tends to be more of a balanced approach to not just looking at what can the individual do intrinsically, but what can the environment facilitate, I guess, in terms of certain behaviors, as you mentioned, that we want them to do. Exercise. If we want people to exercise, we can't just focus on, let me educate you, let me teach you why it's important, because that might not be why you're not exercising. It might be a different reason. So I know we don't have 20 minutes for me to do the preamble to that, but I guess my philosophy would be more of a balanced approach to health, rather than just a one-dimensional, you're either healthy or you're not healthy, and it's because of your behavior, and that's it. I think there's so much more that goes into defining health.
So we'll leave it on that note. We'll leave it on balance, because that's a really good visual. The scales of justice. Yes. So, thank you so much, Andrew, Dr. Piazza, for this opportunity.
Thank you for having me.
Join me for another edition of Connecting the Dots.
Please note that the information provided in this show is not a substitute for consulting with an experienced local attorney and receiving counsel based on the facts and circumstances of a particular transaction. To contact Lizbeth, email her at lisbeth@elizabethlmyska.com or call her office at 508-753-7681. We're online at connectingthedots.lawyer. Executive producers, Liz Myska and Jack Peacock. Producers, John Medberry and Bill Hamilton. A production of Elizabeth L. Myska, JD, LLM, in association with Compliments.